What is going on, guys? Gaston right here, and yes, Sony finally announced the Sony FX3, and like I mentioned in all my leaks, it was going to be identical as the Sony A7S3, and what happened? It is identical to the Sony A7S3. But I'm not going to be talking about that because the whole internet right now is talking about that. We already covered weeks ago. But in this video, what I want to do is I want to help you decide which camera to get. But also we're going to talk about what a missed opportunity the Sony FX3 was, because I have a camera right here that I love. I adore this camera. This one is the Sony FX6. And I think that Sony missed a huge opportunity in making the Sony FX3 a mini FX6. So we're going to be talking about that coming right up. Welcome back to the channel, guys. Gaston right here, and if you're new to this place, remember that I'm giving away a brand new Zhiyun Crane 2S, and all you have to do is simply read the rules right here. I'm also going to be listing them down in the description, and the announcement is going to happen April 5th, so good luck to all of you guys. All right, let's talk about the Sony FX3, because a lot of people are a little bit disappointed, including myself. And we said it, this camera was going to be a Sony A7S3. Now let's talk about some of the differences really quick to get this out of the way, because there are not that many. A is going to be the most obvious. The Sony FX3 doesn't have this beautiful 9.64 million dots EVF in resolution, which is actually great. Number two, the body of the Sony FX3 is much more in line with the Sony A7SIII. Number three, the Sony FX3 features fan. Well, this camera only features passive cooling system. And I think that this is pretty much where all the differences are gonna end, unless you wanna talk about the quarter screw mounts that you have right there and another one here. But, you know, other than that, the cameras are almost identical, even in resolution, codecs, the whole 9 yards. And even the FX3 also shoots still, so it's a hybrid shooting camera. All right, so let's talk about the missed opportunity, because the Sony FX3 bears the name Cinema Line right on the camera. You can read that. And I think that it misses the mark of Cinema Line for several reasons that I'm gonna talk about in just a moment. Well, the number one thing is that the camera also shoots pictures, and you know, in reality, cinema cameras don't shoot pictures. I mean, I'm not saying that that is a fact for a camera now be considered cinema camera, but you know, it goes to show you that it's a camera more in line with content creation and maybe amateur shooting than professional cinema work. So let me actually introduce you to this camera that I picked up a couple of weeks ago and really has changed the game for me, because I think that the Sony FX3 should have been closer to this camera than the Sony A7S3. And even though the Sony FX6 features a lot of the same technologies of the Sony A7S3, such as sensor and some other things, it has a lot of great tools that are so useful and makes my experience, you know, a lot better than shooting with the Sony A7S3. The first one that I want to talk about is the exposure tools that I get with the Sony FX6. Now, the FX3 has the old school histogram, and pretty much that's it. You know, I think it's a pretty antiquated way of gauging exposure. But the Sony FX6 has Waveform. In my opinion, one of the best tools to gauge exposure. I love using Waveform. Also, you have scopes as well. And of course, you have the histogram. But another thing that I wish both cameras had, the FX3 and the FX6, is false color, something that I have in my Canon C70. Now, false color is a great tool to gauge exposure when you have, you know, multiple elements that you want to nail exposure, such as skin tone, skies, backgrounds, you know. False colors is a lot better because you have color representations of the different exposure values, but I would have been just fine if I got in the FX3 only the waveforms. Now, the other thing that I use a lot in this camera, and one of the things that you're gonna see in most cinema cameras, is the fact that this camera, the FX6, has shutter speed and also shutter angle. And I shoot with shutter angle all the time, because shutter angle pretty much does the calculation for you. You set the frame rate and the camera is gonna double 180 degrees, so if you're at 24 frames per second, the camera is gonna set the shutter speed at 48. And if you switch to S&Q, 120 frames per second, the camera is gonna switch it to 240 shutter speed automatically for you. Now, a lot of the times I forget, to be honest with you, with the Sony A7S III, especially when you're running and gunning and doing 20,000 things. So having the capability for the camera just to do it on their own is actually really, really nice. And I think the Sony could have done it via a simple firmware update. Now, none of the things that we're mentioning before are things that probably would require, you know, a brand new hardware or just reinventing the wheel. I think it could have been, you know, a little bit of borrowing the same code that they have in this firmware and putting in the camera, but they didn't give us that. Now let's talk about one of the most important things that made me actually grab this camera, and that is going to be the fact that we have variable ND filters in the Sony FX6. And I understand that the Sony FX3 has IBIS and digital image stabilization, and usually when you have that, it's really hard for a camera manufacturer to stick on the sensor, in front of the sensor, also some sort of variable ND filter, but I would much rather Sony remove completely the IBIS and put variable ND filters than giving us embodied image stabilization, because to be honest with you, while the image stabilization of the Sony A7S3 is okay, it is not perfect and it's not going to replace a gimbal. So I'd much rather use a gimbal with my camera, and especially that camera because it's so small, it would have been perfect and it would have been very justifiable not have IBIS and, you know, giving us variable ND filters. At least some sort of pop-in ND filters, you know, by one stop or two stops, that would have been great. Now, another thing that I wish that the Sony FX3 had was a different battery, because remember, although the NP-FZ100 has great battery life in the Sony A7S3, remember that the FX3 now has to also run fans and also supply phantom power to your microphone via XLR. Now, the Sony FX6 uses this battery right here. This is the BPU35, and this battery actually lasts a long time, and even better if you put a BP60 batteries of the same kind. Now, the other thing that I wish that Sony would have taken more advantage is the handle. Now, when you look at the handle of the FX6, this handle is full of feature galore. So let me tell you some of the features that you have. You have a movie record button, you know, very handy to stop your movie if you're shooting like this. Number 2, you have a joystick, 2 custom buttons, a hold button, you have a dial, you have a zoom rocker right there, you have another hot shoe mount right there, and you even have a scratch microphone and a whole mounting options around the handle. I would have been just fine if Sony would have added at least a movie record button, because, you know, it would have been really nice just to grab the camera there and control it on and off, you know, with a push of a button. But that's not the case. So I'm personally really underwhelmed with this camera. I'm also very confused. I don't know what Sony was trying to do, because other than adding some features that are not that useful, we pretty much got the same thing twice, way more expensive. Now, the Sony A7S3 costs you $3,500 versus the $3,900 of the Sony FX3. But yes, you get some more stuff for your money. You get the handle and you get the XLR module. However, the XLR module is exactly the same module that I have right here actually using to record this, but when I got the module, I think I paid around $600, but the module came with a microphone that is actually really good. Now, the FX3 doesn't bring you a microphone, so if you don't have a microphone, you're gonna have to invest in a microphone. Now, at that time, I think you're better off getting a Sony A7III and the external XLR module that Sony sells separately that also comes in microphone, and you may be actually even cheaper than getting the FX3 and then having to buy a good quality, you know, shotgun microphone. Also remember, with this camera, you have the best EVF that Sony has ever created, and probably the best EVF from any camera manufacturer, period. So guys, let me know, what do you think that the Sony FX3 should have been? You know, what other feature you think this camera should have? Let me know in the comments down below, and as always, subscribe to this channel for more content like this one. I'll see you in the next video.